Hello everyone, my name's Tom. I think to speak at this meetup today you have to be called Tom, so it's convenient. So yeah, I'm Tom, I'm the CTO at Grafana Labs. I run our R&D department. So Grafana Labs, company's about 10 years old. I've been at the company now about 7 years. Company's about 1,300 people, R&D's about 600 of that. I live in London, but R&D at Grafana Labs is in 50 different countries now, and we're fully remote first, so we don't have any offices, basically. I still think of myself as a software engineer. So I wrote a piece. My biggest claim to fame, I guess, is I wrote Loki, which is this log aggregation system. Has anyone here heard of Loki? A few of you? Okay, it's like if you've heard of like Elasticsearch or Splunk, like it's a modern version of that, basically. I used to work on a piece of software called Prometheus. I'm still one of the maintainers of that software, though I should probably stop saying that because I haven't done a PR for like 2 years. And I also wrote this piece of software called Cortex, which is a horizontally scalable version of Prometheus, right? So people here familiar with Prometheus? Same, a few more people, right? Yeah, okay. So Cortex takes like Prometheus, which works on a single machine, and makes it work on very large clusters of machines and scale to, billions of series. So it's actually, funnily enough, and this will be a recurring theme throughout the talk, Cortex is the piece of open source software that Amazon uses to run Amazon's managed Prometheus. So kind of everything I do seems to be taken by Amazon and used to great success. Not mine. If you want to follow me, this is an old slide, so I still have the old Twitter logo on there. I'm not really on Twitter anymore. I am on Blue Sky. Honestly, I'm just tom@grafana.com if you want to get hold of me. That's probably the easiest way. At least my assistant will respond to you that way. And yeah, when I'm not doing CTO stuff, for whatever that means, I do a lot of 3D printing. Like if you've ever seen a recording of me on YouTube or anything, you'll see behind me is just like loads of 3D printers. And so I design lots of 3D stuff that I print. I'm making this little 3D printed desktop wind tunnel to put toy cars in. Because my brother is a Formula One designer, so for his birthday I made him a desktop wind tunnel to put cars he designed in. I also make my own beer. I make a lot of pizza as well. During the pandemic, taught myself to make pizza. I'm really into cars, so I've a bit of a fleet of cars, but I probably shouldn't talk about that too much. I try. There is an Instagram account for my cars, but it's not associated with my name because, people don't like it when you brag, basically. So I'm not going to talk any more about my cars.
Well, there wasn't any money in open source.
That is not true. Not true at all. Right. So the structure of the talk is generally I'm going to talk about every job I've had. Like it's only 5 or 6 jobs. But what I want to do is I've made a lot of mistakes in my career. And I want you to not repeat the mistakes I've made. Right? That is really the point of this talk. So from every job I've had or every company I've worked out or started, I'll talk about how I managed to screw it up. And hopefully you can avoid that. Now, it all started, I was very fortunate to go to Cambridge University. I went to King's College at Cambridge, which is the background here. I chose King's because it was the one with the most state school people, and I went to a state school. I definitely did not fit in the whole Cambridge scene. But the reason this is relevant is the professor for computer science at King's in Cambridge was a chap called Ian Pratt, who was a chap who started the Zen hypervisor project. Now, has anyone here heard of the Zen? Other than, yeah, you've heard of it because we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, but yeah. So Zen, a hypervisor is a thing you use to virtualize your software, right? You can take a physical machine and you can run multiple virtual machines on that physical machine, yeah? So you might have heard of VMware. These are the guys who kind of made this more popular. You might have heard of KVM, which came after Zen as the one that's baked into the Linux kernel. So Zen was the first kind of open source virtualization system, right? And it's very novel and clever in the way it achieved it. It used this technique called para-virtualization, so it didn't do full virtualization, but it was, and then we ended up working with Intel to add the HVM extensions to x86 architecture. It was incredible, as a research project that then spun out of the computer lab at Cambridge to form a company called ZenSource, right? Because it started from this academic background, it was all open source. In fact, Zen was a fork of the Linux kernel. In Zen 1, it was literally the Linux kernel with a different ABI that you, instead of running applications on top of, you ran virtual machines on top of. In Zen 2, the architecture changed fundamentally, so it was less associated with the Linux kernel then. I was not a kernel engineer, still not a kernel engineer. I've done a bit of kernel code, but I was actually a UI engineer at ZenSource. So I worked on a C# WinForms application, which was called Zen Center, which was the management tool for Zen, right? back in the day, it was almost a looked down upon role to be a front-end engineer. I don't think it is now. Now I've got my speaker notes somewhere. No, I don't. Let's try again, shall we? My speaker notes, just to make sure. Yeah, so this was my first experience with open source, was working on the Zen hypervisor. Zen followed the kind of Linux kernel model for open source. There was a mailing list, and you could go and you could send patches to the mailing list, and a chap called Keir Fraser would review them and merge them. Keir was very much at the time was the Linus of the Zen project. And that was interesting. Like, this predates GitHub, for instance, right? Predates the whole pull request model. And because Zen originally started life as a fork of the Linux kernel, it was GPL. It was GPL v2 as a license, right? So part of this talk, I'm going to talk about licensing, because when we get to the Grafana things, it gets interesting. But yeah, and it was an open source project and still is an open source project, right? And in fact, I think the product Zen server still exists and is still used, but Zen as an open source project lives on in the Linux Foundation still. Funnily enough, the thing that happened around this time is a small online book company thought they would launch something they called a cloud, right? And they needed a way of kind of partitioning up physical machines and renting out small bits of those physical machines. And so they used Zen to do that. And that's how Amazon got started with EC2 and what we now know as AWS, right? So, I worked on the open source project for a company called ZenSource, which was this tiny little startup. We sold a piece of software called Zen Server, which competed with VMware's, I think they called it ESXi at the time. But yeah, the people that actually made this project successful were Amazon, right? They used the open source to run Amazon Cloud. They don't anymore. I believe they've done their own thing now. Final thing to say about Zen was got bought for $500 million, ZenSource, by a company called Citrix. Probably have heard of Citrix. At the time, I think that might have been the biggest acquisition in tech in the UK. So this was in 2007, like about a year after I joined, which was pretty cool. I didn't make any money out of that, to be very clear. I only joined about 9 months before the acquisition, and my stock options weren't really worth anything at the time. I was a front-end engineer. I had no idea how companies worked or what the sales team was. I don't even know how much revenue ZenSource had, to be honest, which is weird, right? The lesson I took from this is I thought doing tech startups was easy, right? I'd just seen, this chap I knew start a company and sell it for $500 million. And this looks easy, right? So I thought I'll do one of my own. So you have to have, the first lesson is you need a little bit of hubris, right? A little bit of kidding yourself that this is not going to be hard. Because if you actually knew how hard it was going to be, you would never do it. It's I don't have children, but it's my friends who have children tell me, if you knew how hard it was going to be to have a kid, you would never have one, right? But it's the same with a startup, basically. The other thing I learned from ZenSource is, and learned, not at the time, but years later, is the fact that as an engineer, I thought sales and the commercial side of the company was someone else's job was a huge flaw in my character. It is not someone else's job. It has to be your job, especially if you want to start your own company, even as a technical. I'm assuming everyone here is probably a technical. If you're going to be a technical founder, you have to get into sales, I'm afraid. You are going to be the one who sells your product. So, it's weird how the world comes full circle, because the CEO of ZenSource, one of the founders and CEO, is a chap called Peter Levine, who I spoke to last year on the phone, because he ended up being a partner at one of the world's biggest venture capitalists called Andreessen Horowitz. And he invested in a company called Asserts, which is a small startup on the West Coast that I bought last year. And so it's also a bit weird that there's that random connection back to Zen. I think he barely remembered me. I mean, I was a UI engineer and he had, a couple hundred engineers in his company. But you never know, especially early on in your career, how the people you meet and the people you build relationships with will benefit or not later on in your career. And there's a lot of examples of that in this, right? So I left Zen after a couple of years. I had a whale of a time, learned a huge amount, drank far too much. The office was next to a pub, and had, really, really enjoyed myself and thought I had a recipe for success, right? I'd seen how the founders had done it at ZenSource, and thought if I just copy that in a different space, like I will be successful as well. So with a couple of friends of mine, I started a company called Akunu, and this was my first startup, right? I started it when I was 23. And we originally were doing storage for virtual machines, right? Zen was virtualization, so I was like, when Zen saw start, one of the hardest things was virtualization, was storage. So I thought I'd start a company doing storage for virtual machines. I couldn't actually find a version of the logo with a transparent background, so I've used a tool to do it, and it's done a terrible job. We started this company of one of the founders, a chap called Andy, was a fellow at Oxford University at the time. So I moved to Oxford with Tim, my other co-founder, and the three of us in Oxford started a company called Akunu to do storage for virtual machines. Very quickly realized, no one's going to buy storage for virtual machines off of three random chaps in the UK. So we pivoted and ended up taking a lot of the technology we'd developed and applied it to the NoSQL market. So at the time, a big trend was like big data and NoSQL, and there was this piece of software called Cassandra. Has anyone here used Apache Cassandra? A few of you? Okay, so we became the first commercial entity behind the Apache Cassandra project. We built an enterprise version of Cassandra and sold that with a novel storage engine we called Castle, which was also GPL. Cassandra was Apache. And it was kind of, it was an interesting journey. I learned a lot from doing Akunu. So one, again, I was technical, and so I'm like, sales is someone else's problem, and so we didn't sell anything. Two, we thought to start a company, to do a tech startup, the first thing you did was raise money. So that's what we tried to do. And we did end up raising about $10 million, 10 million pounds, I'm not quite sure exactly how much, $10 million, I think. But like, why the hell did we raise that much money, like, with no product and no technology and nothing? Like, just, with a slide deck. Like, it was the worst decision in my life in hindsight, right? You're basically giving away a huge tranche and of your company, a huge swathe of your equity, and in return for some money, and at the same time started a clock ticking, right? So the expectations of the investors very quickly became like, you got to hire, you got to build a team, you got to sell, you got to, and we were not ready to do that, right? So Akunu was not very successful, to be very clear, right? We did eventually sell the company to Apple. I don't think it's public how much we've sold it for, and I probably signed a document to say I shouldn't tell you. But it was not a lot of money.
How many zeros?
It was not. There was a lot of money on the deal, but like most of it went to the investors because they own most of the company, right? Like, it was enough to like buy a house in London, so it was, it was nice money, but like it was not life-changing amounts of money. The other thing is like, you just realized very quickly in the Akunu days that like, okay, I'm on this treadmill. Like there is a model that venture capitalists assign to businesses, right? And if you don't fit that model, you're in trouble, right? And that model is generally raise money every couple of years. They're going to take a large chunk of the business every time you raise money, and you've got to hit certain growth targets to unlock that. Right, so, and what I learned from this is I don't really like VCs. I mean, they're lovely people sometimes, but I did not understand the venture capital model when I went and raised money. I did not know what I was getting myself into, and I ended up owning less than 5% of my own company at the end of it, right? So I did not make, the VC world is not free money, right? They definitely extract, they take huge risks, right? And so it's a good function in society that a lot of companies wouldn't grow and exist if they didn't exist. But like they do take something in return, right? It's not free money. They're not your friends. This is a business. They have a model. And if you're thinking of starting a company, go and understand and talk to other founders about what the right strategy for fundraising is. And my advice to most founders now is don't raise money until you need it, right? Find another way to bootstrap your business. And you'll see the latest startup I did, we bootstrapped. Also like my last comment on Akunu, we ended up being like 30 or 40 people. We were based literally like 300 yards from here on Old Street. Had a whale of a time. I really enjoyed myself, but didn't realize that that's not the point of doing a startup. Startups are businesses, they're supposed to make money, you're supposed to sell things, and you're supposed to eventually sell more than you spend, right? And that's how you run a business, right? Did not realize any of that. I mean, I was 24. The other really unfortunate thing that I learned here was that naming is very hard, right? So Akunu, we thought, we just did, you were computer scientists, right? So we searched for all the 5-letter domains that were still available and the ones that made any reasonable sense and were pronounceable, and we wrote a script that did it, came up with a short list, and Hakunu sounds good, yes, we'll do that. And people thought it was a riff on like Hakunu Matata. It's not, it's just a 5-letter domain that's available. Our first employee, well not our first, but one of our first employees was a French girl called Louise, a software engineer. She used to sit next to me. And a few years after she joined, she mentioned that she'd never actually told her parents the name of the company she works for. And I'm like, why is that? Because in French, un cul nu means a naked bum. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah. So naming's hard. And ever since then, I've never been allowed to name anything. But yeah, so that's like, that was Hakunu. Now, I didn't actually see Hakunu through to the end, right? I left about 6 months before it sold to Google. And Tim, the co-founder, the CEO, did the exit. Lots of reasons, but primarily the main reason is Google came knocking at my door. And as I described, like I've been doing this company for 4 or 5 years, and it wasn't being that successful. There's a year before we started the company where we were basically working on it for free, and we weren't being that successful, and the VCs had taken a huge amount of equity in the company, and generally I'd fallen out of love with my own company, right? Google comes knocking and offers incredibly large salaries. I think my salary at Google, I mean, again, remember in 2013 I would have been 27, right? And my salary in the first year was probably 300 or 400K. It was ridiculous. Oh. Yeah. Like, so it's hard to say no to that, right? And I would, this Uber had just come out at the time, and I, would ride an Uber Lux to work every day. It's ridiculous. And Google's a fantastic place to work. I was a manager in site reliability engineering. I learned, in the 2 years I was at Google, I learned so much. Like, it's like going back to university, but this time actually I paid attention and drank less. And they also have a huge amount of training available to you. So I learned how to make really good coffee, for instance. Like literally, I did a barista training course whilst I was at Google, and I still, to this day, obsess about coffee. But they also did a really good management training course. Now I realized, I'd been a software engineer at ZenSource, then I started my own company, and you start your company, obviously you're gonna manage people, that's kind of your job. When I got to Google, I'm like, oh, this management training sounds interesting, I should probably do some of that, thinking that I was quite good at my job, and realizing after going through the management training that I was the worst manager in the world. Like I now knew all the things I did badly and actually didn't really want to get better at it either. I wanted to go back and be a software engineer. So I learned how to run stuff at scale. I learned about observability. I learned about operations, about what eventually we called GitOps, but back then we just called it config management. I learned about building SaaS software and multi-tenancy. It was fantastic. I learned 2 years. I learned more at Google than I did for 3 years at Cambridge. And I learned I was a terrible manager. And so I kind of decided after this that I'm going to take a bit of, and then the money from Hakunu came through, bought a house, and I took some time off. Right? I took about a year off in my career. And again, big lesson here. There's very few lessons to learn from Google, to be honest. Like other than go and work at Google for 2 years, you'll learn a huge amount if you can. But also take some time off. When I've basically been, this is about the midpoint in my career after Google, and I'm like, took a year off, learned to brew beer, got into 3D printing, just like develop some hobbies. Like really don't get to kind of your 50s and not have any hobbies. That's quite sad, right? So yeah, that was what I took from Google. I mean, obviously all the other lessons are like how to build SaaS and this kind of stuff. And I've been trading on like the stuff I learned at Google about observability and about Prometheus and about DevOps and SRE. And I've been trading on that for the next 10 years, right? But yeah, I spent some time at Google and it was fun. Did not do any open source. So I'll gloss over that, right? The other thing to say about Google is like, up until that point in my career, I'd never actually been at a company that had more revenue than it had costs. Like every company I'd worked for basically was spending VC money at that point, ZenSource and my company. And that was the first time, I was exposed to a company at Google that made more money than it spent, which was a weird feeling. Anyway, so I took a year off. I didn't intend to take exactly a year off. I wasn't quite sure what I intended to do. I did start an open source home automation project called Home Automation. Again, don't let me name things. But it was exactly the same time as another chap started a project called Home Assistant, right? And I wrote it in Python, And like mine was basic. If you look back at it, like, oh, it's a crappy version of Home Assistant. And I'm now like a huge Home Assistant user. But yeah, so I was thinking at the time I was probably going to start a company around home automation because I was starting to not just want to start startups because starting startups is cool, which, let's face it, was the reason I started my first one. But I was starting to because I had an idea of the kind of company I wanted to build, right? And in particular at the time, I was deluded and thought I wanted to build a B2C company, right? I wanted to sell software to consumers, not to other businesses. I've since learned that is a terrible idea. So I was building this home automation system. We had like 5 or 10 users, and then it never went anywhere. And B2C is really hard, and there's no profit in it, and it's just like so. I then started very informally advising 3 or 4 of my friends' startups in London. And when I say informally advising, like I'd go to the pub with them for a beer and ask them how their company is going. And one of my friends at the time was starting a company called Weaveworks. And he was telling me about this WeaveNet thing and this whole Docker thing. And this is before Kubernetes existed. And it reminded me very much of Google, of the internal technology we had at Google. And there's this pattern where every ex-Googler tries to recreate what Google had just in open source, right? Like that's how CoreOS existed, right? CoreOS got bought by Red Hat, which got bought by IBM, obviously. Like, there's so many companies and open source technologies that are re-implementations of internal tech from Google. Like Prometheus is a re-implementation of, is a heavily inspired by Borgmon, which is Google's internal monitoring system. And so Weaveworks sounded like fun to me. And so I joined Weaveworks, and I think it says here I was engineer number 7. So not a founder. We had this Docker networking thing before, when Docker was really new and didn't have its own networking, and we thought this would be a good business. Unfortunately, Docker built their own network, bought another company and turned that into embedded networking, and WeaveNet kind of died on the vine. So we spent the next 2 years trying to find something else to do with the money we'd raised. And I didn't really see eye to eye with founders on a lot of the business strategy decisions. Like I did not want to repeat a lot of the mistakes I'd made in Akunu, and they did. So I left, not under particularly good terms, and I regret that to be really honest. Like I burnt a lot of bridges when I left Weaveworks, and I think in hindsight, I said at the beginning about like you don't know who's going to come back later in life to haunt you, and like I just feel like I could have been a better person when I left Weaveworks. But anyway, one of the many projects we started at Weaveworks was this hosted Prometheus thing called Cortex. And that was a project we started at Weaveworks. I started when I was at Weaveworks. And I wanted them to focus all their energy on this project and stop working on the 10 other projects that we were working on. And because I thought the hosted Prometheus market would be, a $1 billion market. They disagreed with me, so I quit, started a company to do it myself, which was Causal. And it was just me and David, 2 of us. We bootstrapped the company, right? So we didn't raise VC. We did part-time consulting for whoever would have us to pay the bills. We ran a hosted Prometheus service using Cortex, the open source software that I started at Weaveworks. And it went quite well. Like the hypothesis was you could sell this thing, and people didn't want to run their own Prometheuses, but wanted to buy a hosted version. And I think in the first 6 months, we signed up 3 or 4 customers, over 100 grand in revenue in the first 6 months. It was like we clearly hit a nerve. The first customer was a London customer. Funnily enough, and again, you never know who's going to help you later in life, was the CTO at Spotify, was an engineer from ZenSource, a chap called Richard Sharp, who was a professor at Cambridge as well. And I bumped into him in SFO airport. Hadn't seen him for 5 years, 6 years, and was like, oh, I've started this new thing called Causal, and we're doing hosted Prometheus. He's like, I need some of that. Come in, when you land, come to the office, talk to my SRE team, and within a couple of months, they'd signed a contract and were our biggest customer. Which is, and again, you never know. Don't burn bridges, foster those relationships, because you will need them later on in life.
Did you find out what that meant in French?
Causal just means causal, just with a K. It's the German spelling. The co-founder, David, who still works at Grafana Labs, by the way, still works for me at Grafana Labs. I don't know how he tolerates me. But it tells me that this is just the German spelling of causal. But the actual idea behind causal wasn't hosted Prometheus. I wanted to build a Prometheus-inspired logging service. And this comes because I was using Kubernetes and I was running Cortex on top of Kubernetes. And the biggest problem I had was log aggregation. kubectl logs at the time was rubbish. And I would forget your logs as soon as the pod goes away. And I was never a big fan of Java, and so I didn't want to use Elastic, and Splunk was expensive. And so I wanted to build like a Golang implementation, Prometheus-inspired logging system that was going to be kind of Kubernetes native. And that was what we actually started Causal to do. And I wrote a prototype of it. And there's even some early talks of me like demoing a very, very demoware version of this. And that was the whole idea. Now, we never actually brought the logging system to market whilst we were at Causal, because about 9 months in, I met the founders of Grafana Labs. So Grafana Labs at the time, 7-8 years ago, Grafana Labs was a tiny little company, with 25 people. It was called Rain Tank, so no one even knew it existed. But it had this Grafana project, and Grafana was already very popular. Like, it was already obviously going to be a very popular piece of software. But the reason eventually I joined Grafana Labs, they bought Causal, wasn't the tech, it was the culture we were building. And the one thing that I take from my Causal days is David and I sat down very early on and talked about what it is we wanted to do with our startup, right? And instead of it, I want to start a startup for ego's sake, right? Because it's cool, because let's face it, was why I started Akunu. This was, no, I want to start a startup because I want to scratch my own itch. I have this problem, this log aggregation, Prometheus Kubernetes inspired log aggregation, and I want to solve it. It doesn't exist out there, right? Also, I wanted to start Causal because I didn't want to raise VC, right? I didn't want to work for another VC-funded startup, right? David lived in Berlin, I lived in London. I was not moving to Berlin. David was not going to move to London. So I wanted to do the remote first work from home thing. And we wanted to, we had this thesis that we'd, like Prometheus, we'd make the log aggregation system we built open source, and we'd make our money by running a hosted version of it, a SaaS version of it, right? So we had these things we felt very strongly about like how we wanted to build an organization. And nowadays you'd just call that we had a concept for a culture, right? What have I written here? I said, getting the why right up front matters, right? You shouldn't start a company because you want to start a company, right? That's a terrible reason to start a startup. You should start a startup because some other reason, whatever that reason, and that reason is going to be personal to you. For me, I've just described the 4 reasons I wanted to start Causal, right? I wanted to be remote first. I wanted to scratch an itch. I wanted it to be open source, and I wanted to bootstrap it, right? But like a lot of people start companies, and I made this mistake with Akunu because they think it's easy, because it looks cool, because you can go around saying I'm a founder, right? I'm an entrepreneur. I hate that word. So get the why right up front and consider bootstrapping your startup. They're the lessons I learned from Causal. So finally, met the founders of Grafana Labs. I knew a lot of the Grafana Labs engineers because we moved in the same circles, the same ecosystems. But I didn't know the founders very well, and I met them. It was in Austin DockerCon in 2017, which is weird because it snowed in Austin, Texas at DockerCon at the wrong time of year, so it's very memorable. But I met the CEO, and we just really hit it off. We realized that they were trying to build the same company, trying to build the same culture that we were trying to build. They were 2 years ahead of us, 3 years ahead of us, right? They had a bit more traction, and in particular, they had Grafana as an open source project. And it was very clear for me at Causal, like I was either going to have to compete with Grafana or I was going to join them, right? There was no way to avoid this. So we decided to join them. And they bought my startup. Again, not going to say exactly how much for. It was not a lot of money, right? It was less money than I made from the Akunu days. But what I did get was good equity in the company, right? That was the negotiation. I joined Grafana Labs as an engineer, right? Working on Prometheus and working on what now became Loki, which is the L in the bottom, right? Loki is the log aggregation system that I've been talking about from the Causal days. We gave it a name, we gave it a logo, we eventually built Tempo as well. The Mimir is what Cortex became, and we ended up with the LGTM stack, which like some of you will recognize as like, looks good to me. It's the thing you write in your code reviews, but it's our monitoring stack. I spent the first year or so trying to get customers to use, again, remember the thing I said from the Akunu days, like even if you're an engineer, your job in a startup is to get customers, right? Is to get customers to buy your software. Not necessarily because you're going to get paid more for that. You're not a salesperson in that respect, but because that's the only way you're really going to find out if what you're building is worth anything, is if you can convince someone to give you money for it. Like, I mean, it sounds very reductive, but that is literally the case. Like, if you can't convince someone to pay you for this, it's probably not worth doing. So I spent the first year trying to get people to pay me for the hosted Prometheus thing. And I remember the exact day when someone said, yeah, okay, I'll pay for this. Like, and it was a company called The Trade Desk, big ad tech company in New York. They're still a customer to today. And they were our first six-figure customer on our hosted Prometheus platform. And
it took you a year to get the first sale.
It took us about a year to get the first six-figure sale. Like, we'd had a bunch of smaller ones, but like the first one that actually started to make us real money. This was on top. We still had Spotify and three or four other small ones, but like the first big one. And I remember because like they said very upfront, like, we'll pay you for this. Like, and this is how much we'll pay you, but here's all the stuff we need it to do before we'll pay you. And it was non-functional stuff. They needed it to be faster, more scalable, more reliable. Brilliant, right? Because I'm an engineer, I love that kind of stuff, right? So I just really look back on these days in like, that was the last time I was a real software engineer, to be honest. Like, that was when I wrote a lot of the scaling algorithms in Cortex, a lot of the query sharding, and a lot of the work that made Cortex very fast and reliable and scalable.
What do you think about the balance between trying to build something that like will prove value, show like a prospective customer what you're trying to build, and then like all the work going towards optimizing, making it scalable, and those sorts of things? Because like, of course you spend loads of time making it really fast, really scalable, but if it doesn't illustrate what we're trying to propose to the customer, then it's
there's huge confirmation bias here, right? Like, when I wrote Cortex, I made it scalable from day zero. And so I would stand here and say, oh, you need to make it scalable from day zero. But that's just confirmation bias by what worked for me. And what worked for me might not work for you. Like, and the generally accepted principle is don't worry about scalability or performance. Like, try and prove the concept first, because you can always hire smart engineers to bolt that on later. And the real evidence of that one is Loki. Because when I wrote Loki, the log aggregation system, it was crap. Real crap. Like, it really just basically didn't work. And when we launched it and demoed it, everyone immediately got the idea, a Prometheus-inspired log aggregation system, written in Go, using Kubernetes. And very few people actually bothered to try it and realize it didn't really work. But what did happen was a chap called Ed Welsh came knocking on my door and said, I really like this Loki thing you've built, but it's crap. And I'm like, yeah, you're not wrong. Why don't you fix it? And he did. And he came work for Grafana Labs and he improved it. And it turns out like it was at this point that I was transitioning more into becoming like a leader and a manager. The best thing I could do was write a crappy piece of software, because if the concept and idea and the product market fit would be the term to use, right, is there, it's easier to find engineers to make the software not crap.
People gravitate towards wanting to use it, people gravitate towards wanting to fix it to make it better.
Yeah. And like, that's if that's the old adage, the old XKCD, right? If you want an answer on the internet, the thing you post is not a question, you post the wrong answer, right? Like, post a question, post the wrong answer, and someone will correct you. Like, that's Loki for you, right? Like, I posted the question and a wrong answer, and a whole team of people stood up and fixed it over the next few years. So that was kind of, I eventually ended up building out the database team at Grafana Labs, and then they asked me to run Grafana Cloud, and so I built out the cloud team, about 100, 150 people at this point, and then slowly built out more and more and more of the Grafana engineering team until about 2 years ago, they said, would you like to be the CTO? And the last bit of Grafana engineering, which was the actual Grafana project, moved into my organization as well. And so now I'm the CTO at Grafana Labs, which is weird because I still think of myself as a software engineer, as I said. I guess the things I learned about Grafana, it's still learning, right? We're still, the nice thing about Grafana is it's no one's first startup. So it's full of people like me who have made some really interesting and novel mistakes in the past and are dead set on not repeating them. Just making new, even more interesting mistakes, which we've definitely made a lot of. We're now, things are going pretty well. Like, we passed 250 million in revenue over 12 months ago. I think that's the only number I'm allowed to say publicly. We're like 1,300 people. Like, Grafana as a piece of software is top 10 most popular open source projects in the world. and Loki, Mimir, Tempo are very popular as well. There's two things I want to say. There's less lessons about this bit because I'm still learning. Two things I want to say. Like, one is we did a big license change. Originally, everything at Grafana was Apache. Right? Apache is a very liberal license, right? You basically do whatever you want with Apache software, including take the software and compete with Grafana Labs, right? And we were seeing people do more and more of that. So whilst that's their right, and that's the license under which we release the software, there was a spate of companies relicensing their open source software. So Elastic famously relicensed to SSPL, which is not an open source license, right? It's a source available license. Mongo relicensed, like loads of companies. And we could see the commercial pressures why we want to do that, in particular the cloud vendors, the cloud providers. If you build a popular open source piece of software, the cloud vendors are going to take it, they're going to run it on their platform, and they're going to use the fact that they've got a massive sales channel to beat you, right? Which is their right. There's nothing morally wrong with that. I don't get upset about this, but it is business, right? So it's also in our right to change the license. So we changed our license to AGPL. Now, I'm quite proud of changing it to AGPL, to be clear. I don't think this was a mistake. I'm proud because we managed to keep it open source. AGPL is a real open source license, right, with all the rights and freedoms associated with open source licenses, right? We did not go to SSPL. And I think that's bore out now, where you see Elastic, I think recently went from SSPL back to AGPL, right? AGPL was the right balance of freedoms between full and real OSI approved open source and, dissuading the cloud vendors from just taking your software. So one lesson, thinking about open source licensing, really getting into the details of that one. The second lesson I take from this is, I'm now on the other side of the table, right? I think at Grafana Labs, I've bought 8 companies, mostly for their technology, mostly small little tech companies. And again, not for a huge amount of money, but similar kind of acquisitions to the Acuna acquisition by Apple or the Causal acquisition by Grafana Labs. And the number of people I bump into who I've worked with over the last 20 years in some form or another, if it's Peter from Andreessen or whoever it happens to be, and not all of them look on me fondly because I think I used to be a bit of a dick sometimes, to be really blunt. And I wish I hadn't, right? I wish I'd been a nicer person to some people. And definitely it's bitten me in the ass a little bit. So that's the lesson from Grafana Labs. It's still going. Who knows what we're going to do next? The nice thing about Grafana is it's not, we're just focused on observability, on helping software engineers understand the behavior of their software, right? That's really our job. But Grafana itself is used by such a wider audience. Loads of people are using it with DBT and ClickHouse as the new BI stack, right? There's people using it to monitor power stations. Please don't use it to monitor power stations. But people use it to visualize industrial processes and the IoT use cases. And there's loads of people using it for security use cases as well. Security is an observability use case, please.
In what way did you think you were a dick? I mean that genuinely.
No.
It's quite easy to be don't be a dick, but I think it's a lot harder to be to recognize.
So I think when I joined Google, they tell you you're all that, right? They seek the best minds, and so you think you're quite smart, and you don't realize you're not. You don't realize I'm not, right? I was never very humble in my early career. I'm a little bit more humble now. Weird way of saying that. And I used to have a certain way of arguing. I love a good argument, and I think most people do. But I could see it coming across as overly aggressive. Definitely not. And I remember looking back on a lot of my career at Google as being really frustrated that other people couldn't keep up or, disagreed and they were wrong. And I look back thinking, well, actually I was wrong half the time and more than half the time. And it's not that they couldn't keep up, most of the people were probably smarter than me. It's just they had a different value function for what they were optimizing for. Their priorities were different to mine and I didn't see that and that was my fault, not theirs. Right, so that was one way I think at Google I was a bit of a dick. After Google, when I decided I'm not going to be a manager anymore, and I thought, I'm going to be a software engineer, and I think I was a pretty good software engineer, I don't know. I mean, I wrote some software that's still around. But I definitely at the time thought I was a brilliant software engineer. And actually, it really turns out I think by the time you're in your late 20s, you've been doing software now for 10 years almost, you've learned all there is to do about building software. The thing you need to learn is how to work with other people, right? Which it took me a very long time to figure that one out, like longer than it should have, right? I thought being a good software engineer was enough, and it isn't, right? The difference, honestly, between a software engineer and a senior software engineer is not how good their code is, it's how well they work with other people, right? And that was a hard lesson for me to learn. So yeah, I think that was, when I say I was a bit of a dick, like I think those two things in particular. You know, it's what's really eye-opening is seeing it in other people. Like a lot of engineers at Grafana Labs, like behave like I used to behave, and I'm like, oh, just don't do that. Like, you know, you'll get so much farther if you listen more than you talk, which is how I know I'm literally giving a talk here, but like, you know, or, you know, if you try and see it from their perspective and understand that this isn't the end of the world if they name their variable like that, it really doesn't matter. Yeah, so yeah, like, be nice to people and it will pay you back. Like, and it was really only kind of like after Weaveworks where I started actively trying to be a nicer and better person. And well, look where I am now, right? You know, turns out that really does pay off. I'm not saying do it because it will pay off, do it because it's the right thing to do. And I credit David, co-founder at, I don't think he's ever gonna watch this, but he'll be blushing. Like, he like confronted me about stop being a dick, Tom. And I'm like, oh, okay, because he's a really nice person. Anyway, so yeah, if there's like 5 lessons, I think it's 5. I wrote these slides like an hour ago before I came here, so. You really do need luck and hubris. Like, I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time, going to Cambridge and joining ZenSource, right? Imagine I'd gone to any other university, and any other college within that university, I never would have joined ZenSource. I never would have seen how easy it is to start a tech startup. It isn't, which comes onto the hubris bit. Or imagine like I had, you know, not bumped into Raj, my now boss, the CEO of Grafana Labs, at DockerCon in Austin, right? And never would have ended up on this path. So you really do need luck, and I know that's a horrible piece of advice because how the hell do you manufacture luck? But you need hubris as well. You need to believe that you can. You need to kind of ignore the people telling you, like me, how hard it's going to be. So second thing, this is the mistake I see most people make. Most technical co-founders make this mistake, right? They spend 2 years heads down writing what they think is the best piece of software they've ever seen, and they don't bother trying to sell it. And it's less about the making the money bit of sales. You eventually hire people to do that. It's more about like, unless you can convince someone to part with cash for what you're doing isn't worth anything. Like literally, like that's how economics works, right? So as a technical co-founder, the thing you don't need to be is better at software engineering. Like you're already good enough, right? The thing you don't need to be is like more of a tech visionary. The thing you need to do is learn how to sell software, right? Which is really, really hard, to be very clear. Like, I was lucky, like I had a sales guy at Grafana Labs take me under his wing and kind of tell me to stop being a dick and listen to customers and teach me how to like sell. And then if you're giving people something for free, the feedback you get is worthless, right? They're gonna tell you what they think. If you're saying you can't have this unless you pay for it, the feedback they give you is invaluable, is the reason they're not gonna pay for it, is the thing you need to fix, right? So like the other thing, I've seen a lot of people go in their first 2 years like, oh, we'll just give it away for free, get loads of really good feedback, and then we'll turn on the money spigot later. That later never happens. And that feedback they got in that 2 years was worthless. So you really do, as a technical founder, need to give a shit about sales. Sorry for the language, but it is 7:30. Post-watershed. Understand the VC model, right? If you do decide to raise money, and my advice would be don't, it's definitely not like immediately, you really should understand what the raising money entails. This doesn't mean like understand like what a term sheet is and so on, but like play it forward 5 years time. Like what happens if I raise this money in 5 years time? What targets am I going to be held accountable for that I might miss? And what happens if I miss them, right? Because most startups fail. Most startups miss their targets, right? Grafana Labs has raised an epic amount of capital from VCs. Like, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's like maybe 600 or $800 million. Like, it's a ridiculous amount of money. But the first 5 years of the company didn't raise any institutional capital. I didn't raise any VC. Like, the founders, to their credit, built an incredibly successful company, basically bootstrapped, with a little bit of friends and family and their own money in there. But basically bootstrapped a successful company. And then only once it was commercially viable and successful did they then go and raise venture capital. And the venture capital we raised obviously accelerated the business to where it is now. And like, I'm very grateful to our VCs. And we have a really good relationship with our venture capitalists who give us really good advice, mostly about the sales, to be very clear. But yeah, like, understand this. Talk to other founders who've had it go badly. Talk to me. I'll happily dole out advice. But yeah, if you're going to do a company and you think you want VC, think again. Yeah, I think I've touched on this one. Don't be a dick. Don't burn bridges. Bite your tongue way more than you think you have to. Like, especially if you're going to, you know, let's face it. Like, I can't go and fix bugs in our code anymore. Like, because I don't know how to, but also like I'm too busy. And it's also not fair on the engineers that I go and do their job, right? Don't compete with your team. So all it really, you know, the only thing that I have to trade on now is the relationships that I've built with my team, with my peers. You know, all I can do is influence people to do stuff. If you ever order an engineer to do something, you kill their motivation, they're probably going to quit, right? So really, like, how do you get people to do things, you know, without telling them to do it, right? Which means you need them to like you, you need to have a relationship with them. No one's going to do that if 5 years ago you shouted at them in a different context, right? Or if you like undermined them or whatever. Like, just don't be a dick. Be nice to people. Turns out, I wish someone had told me this earlier. Last one, fire. Yeah, this is the thing that probably the most recent lesson for me from Causal and Grafana Labs is like that the culture actually matters. Like, in a lot of I'm not going to take a lot of credit for Grafana's success. Like, it's taken a lot of people, a lot of hard work. But one of the things I think we got right very early on at Grafana Labs, and some of it at least comes from Causal, is that we kind of sat down and thought about, why are we doing this? Why do we want to do this? Why? Ask yourself why you're doing it. And if the answer is because you want to be called founder or you want the CEO title, that's the wrong answer, right? Like, doing it because you actually want to scratch your own itch is the whole Cathedral and Bazaar open source model, right? Scratch your own itch. Do it because you want to work in a different way, right? Remote first, open source, whatever it happens to be, and those opportunities are not available. You know, there's a load of really good answers. Do it because you want to change the world, you know, through crypto or something. I don't know, but doing it just because it's cool and trendy is really not an answer, right? So yeah, they're the 5 things I think. My career is what? A maths, 18 years. Wow. Yeah, I've been doing this for 18 years. I feel a bit old now. But not that long, right? You know, I still probably got another 4 or 5 years in me. And this is what I've learned. Now, what I'm really interested in is like, how have I screwed it up more recently? What things have I not learned from yet, right? Because I'm sure there are going to be numerous of them. Probably giving really egotistical talks like this will be, number 6, don't give talks like this, yeah. Anyway, thank you for listening. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions or anything, yeah.